We're going to pick up right where we left off last week. God has been victorious over Midian. He's caused 120,000 soldiers to be slain by the swords of one another. Now, the rest of those soldiers are fleeing the land of Israel, and Gideon is going to pursue them. But Gideon is no longer afraid. In fact, he's not afraid of anybody in this passage, as we're going to see. God is completely absent from the second half of the story. And like we learned from the story of Ehud, when God is completely absent, it can only mean one thing: pride. Thanks God, but no thanks. I'm going to do things my way. And that's what we're going to see here in the second half of Gideon's life, unfortunately. Today, as we study the rest of this battle and the rest of what happens next, we're going to look at the problems and the consequences of those problems in Gideon's life and look towards a solution, with the main point being this: that to live a godly life is to reject self-glorification. What happens next is that Gideon calls out the tribe of Ephraim, and he has them go and pursue some of these fleeing soldiers who are fleeing through their land and capture the princes and execute them, these princes of the kings of Midian. But we're going to see that Ephraim is not satisfied. Read with me in chapter 8, starting in verse 1. It says, "Then the men of Ephraim said to him, 'What is this that you have done to us, not to call us when you went to fight against the Midian?' And they accused him fiercely. And he said to them, 'What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer? God has given into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. What have I done, and what have I been able to do in comparison with you?' And their anger against him subsided when he said this." What Gideon's just revealed here is a little bit hard to catch, but we've seen his heart. And we're going to see that continually here, actually. Gideon is going to rank the events that happen next and what's unfolding. And look what he says here. He kind of spells it out. When Ephraim comes to him and they're complaining about what happened, he tries to smooth talk them. But in doing so, he denigrates something that God did. In verse 2, "Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer?" What he's saying here, let me interpret, is not the wine better than the grapes that were harvested to make the wine? What he's saying is he's taking this capture of these princes that Ephraim has done and the slaying of the soldiers that they slayed, and he's comparing it to the 120,000 men that were slain when they were surrounded by Gideon's men. Now remember, Gideon's men did absolutely nothing. They just stood there. They blew some trumpets and broke some jars, and they shouted. And God was victorious. But Gideon's just done something. He's ranked what Ephraim has done as above what God has done. And right now, God is last. And we're going to see is that Gideon isn't going for that silver medal. He's going for that gold medal of glory and self-glorification. What we're going to see next from Gideon is something so dangerous for him and for the rest of those who follow him. It's a life out of order. And what a life out of order looks like for us and for Gideon here is that Gideon sits on the throne of his life, a position that is reserved for God. What we're going to see next is Gideon's going for that top spot, that gold medal. He's going to pursue the kings of Midian and capture them himself because it's all about his glory, and he's the one sitting on the throne, right? Read with me in verse 4 down to verse 9. It's going to say, "And Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, he and the 300 men who were with him, exhausted yet pursuing. So he said to the men of Succoth, 'Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian.' And the officials of Succoth said, 'Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your army?' So Gideon said, 'Well then, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh with thorns of the wilderness and with briars.' And from there he went up to Peniel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Peniel answered him as the men of Succoth answered. And he said to the men of Peniel, 'When I come again in peace, I will break down this tower.'" What happens next is that Gideon does capture those kings, and he kills them, and he goes back to those cities, and he executes 77 of the elders. And this is all because they were skeptical, because they didn't believe him. And for those of you paying attention, you might read that passage and think of another passage that we read in chapter 6, where someone responded to God with skepticism. Gideon. God handles Gideon's skepticism by promising his presence and promising he'll be with him. But Gideon is too important to be disrespected by his fellow Israelites, and so he kills them. What we start to see here is that the author is doing something once again. Remember, we said that early on, Gideon was being compared to Moses. Not compared, but kind of contrasted alongside. And the question was he going to be this new Moses? And here, the author takes a turn with this call to kill 77 elders. And now we see that Gideon is being compared not with Moses, but with one of the most violent, horrible people in the Old Testament by the name of Lamech, whose curse was 77 times greater than the curse of Cain. Gideon is no Moses. In fact, he's an anti-Moses who sees himself on an equal or greater playing field than God. The last problem that we see here is that Gideon desires to be king. Now, the people offer him to be king over them in verse 22 of chapter 8. And Gideon says no, but kind of like, no, don't make me king, wink, wink. What he desires is not just to sit on the throne of his life, but on an actual throne over his people. And again, you might say, but Matt, he rejected it. Well, the problem is, as we continue reading, the rest of Gideon's life looks, walks, and quacks like a king. In fact, his youngest son, who we're going to read a lot about after Gideon, is named Abimelech. And Abimelech's name means, my father is king. This is Gideon's desire. He desires power and status over his people and glory. And before we move on, I want to turn the question to us for a second. How do we seek our own glory? How do we seek to take credit for the things that God has done in our lives? When people look back with us and we remember things and see where God's presence has been, do we say, thank you, Lord, for the things that you've done for me? Or do we go, look at the ways that I brought myself up from that mud and that mire, how I pulled myself up from my own bootstraps? A life lived for God is a life that rejects self-glorification. Remember that. The consequences of Gideon's rejection of humility and his self-glorification are about to really hit home. But as a final nail in the coffin before them, we see this consequence play out for the entire people. And Gideon himself leads them astray. It's a tragedy that echoes almost beat for beat exactly what happened at the base of Mount Sinai. We're going to recap this a little bit and kind of explain it, but it's verses 24 through 28. And what Gideon does is he, instead of being king, asks for all the earrings, the gold earrings of the people. And they give them to him. It's a ton. It's a bunch of gold. And he fashions it into this idol, this ephod, this thing that isn't meant to be worshipped, but ends up being worshipped alongside the one true God, Yahweh. We call this syncretism, this confusion of worship that occurs. And this is going to have far-reaching consequences way past just Gideon's life and way past his own son's lives. But we see here as the final, again, nail in the coffin to say, anti-Moses. This direct comparison to the golden calf at the base of Mount Sinai when Aaron, the Levite, collects the earrings of the people and he fashions this golden calf to be worshipped. And they worship it as though it were Yahweh, the one true God, our God. An interesting anecdote that I heard recently that kind of shocked me, but made a lot of sense when I read it again and thought about it is, this guy asked the question, what do you think the Israelites called the golden calf at the base of Mount Sinai in Exodus? And the answer was Yahweh. They were trying to make a thing to focus their worship onto and immediately broke the second commandment. Here again, we see that the people are doing just what they did then. They're not led into this trap by the Canaanites. Maybe the Canaanites modeled it for them. But in the same way that the Egyptians modeled this idol worship for the Israelites in the wilderness, the Canaanites model it for them here, but they are the ones who did it. Israel is the one who has snared themselves or trapped themselves in idol worship. They've confused this thing, this idol, with the worship of God. And it's because of Gideon. Because Gideon is about his own glory. He's not about God's glory, and he's certainly not going to be fazed by raising up a cult in the very place where he tore down a cult just a couple chapters earlier. This is a huge mess. But for us, in our modern context, it can be really hard to go, well, okay, what do we do with this? How is this something we can focus on and gain something from? These problems, these consequences, what's the solution? Before we get to that solution, I just want to say, what are the things in our modern church context that we have accidentally started to worship alongside God? And I want you to think about that for a minute. What are the things that, because of our own pride and selfish ambition, not just our church here, but the greater church, what is actually self-worship that we're calling worship of God? What are the things that we do that don't actually point to God, but point to man instead? Listen, God does not share his throne. We need to be very careful about that. God is not going to share the throne, and he is not going to share his worship. So we need to ask ourselves, are we living a godly life by rejecting self-glorification? Not just even personally in our own personal walk, but corporately. Our church, the church, are we rejecting self-glorification and the things that glorify man and don't glorify God? Our application today is pretty straightforward. It's to live a godly life by rejecting self-glorification. That can seem a little bit broad, but I think I can break it down into 2 steps for us. The first thing is to make sure that you are not seated on the throne of your life. Make sure that you're not seated on the throne of your life, because it leads to destruction. And I know what you might be saying, Matt, I know people who only look out for number one, who every decision that they make is about them, celebrities, rich and famous people. And it seems to be working out pretty good for them. They seem to have everything that they want. Don't be fooled. Living a life for yourself is living a life by yourself. Okay? Let me say that again. Living a life for yourself is living a life by yourself. And we see this in Gideon. God is missing from the entire second half of Gideon's life because he's in it for himself. Gideon lives his life like a king. He has everything that he wants. He has wives and children and money and gold and power and status, but he is lacking the God who brought him out of hiding, who put him up on a solid place and promised his presence to be with him, who delivered him and his people from the hand of an oppressor. Don't do this. Do not put yourself on the throne of your life. It leads to destruction, and it is not good for us. So make sure, number one, that you are not on the throne of your life. The second thing is to make sure that God is the one who is sitting on the throne of your life. Look, in our everyday life, it is very easy for us to put other things on the throne of our life. That's kind of one of the things that we talk about here at the church a lot, is who's on the throne of your life, or what is on the throne of your life. And when it comes to our life, I think a helpful way is to think of it as a solar system. You know, in our solar system, the sun is at the center, and all the planets and everything else rotates around it in our solar system. And if you were to swap the sun with any planet in the solar system or anything else, it would be utter chaos. It wouldn't work. In the same way, as the sun is made to be in the center of the solar system and the planets are to revolve around it, God is meant to be at the center of our life. He is meant to be on the throne of our life. And everything else, including us, is supposed to be just revolving around that, focused on that. Our worship, our energy, our effort is supposed to be focused on that throne. One of the things we can accidentally do in this is try and have God share the throne with something else. Let me tell you, the throne is a seat for one, okay? It's a seat for one person. It's not a love seat. And God is not looking to share that throne. Let's be careful about what and who we are placing at the throne of our lives, at the center of our lives, and make sure that it's God. Don't live life by yourself. Don't worship things alongside God. Don't sit on the throne of your life. Put God, put Jesus at the center of your life, where he is in the place of utmost worship. That is what a life in order looks like. If you live this way, if you put Christ at the center of your life, you will not regret it. This is how to be blessed.